good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Grassroots Education Advocacy, Building Power with me, your host, Zakia Sankara Jabbar. We missed you all last week, but happy to be here this week, and I'm really excited to welcome my guest today. And so my guest today is Mr. James Ford with Creed out of Charlotte, North Carolina. And so I'm going to read a little bit more about James and the amazing work that he's up to in North Carolina. So James Ford is the director of the Center for Racial Equity in Education. That's what CREED stands for. He is an award-winning educator and consultant on issues of equity in education. He is the principal at Filling the Gap Educational Consultants, LLC, and was recently appointed by North Carolina Governor Cooper to serve as a member of the North Carolina State Board of Education representing the Southwest region. He is a former program director at the Public School Forum of North Carolina, which is an education think tank and policy advocacy organization. Prior to this, he served as the 2014-2015 North Carolina Teacher of the Year and representative of the 95,000 public school teachers throughout that state. For a full year, he traveled the state and country speaking before thousands of teachers, students, business leaders, and policymakers about the importance of education. Ford is a self-professed equity warrior. He believes in education as a human right. So do I. He writes and speaks extensively on the topics of race, class, education equity, and advocates for the historically marginalized student populations. James, it is an honor to welcome you. I'm so happy that you agreed to be with us. And I know that you're very busy, particularly because, all of us who have children and families, we're very busy. Our kids are home. You also serve on the school board. So this is a very busy time for you. Welcome to our broadcast today, brother. Please share a little bit more about yourself with our audience.
Well, what's going on, sis? It's good to see you. And I'm honored to have received the invitation. Yeah, so what's going on? A lot going on, as you mentioned, like literally, I'm taking a break during the recess between the first half and second half of the State Board of Education meeting today. And staying busy with these 4 kids, trying to make sure we administer their virtual education as best as possible. So you might hear them screaming in the background. It's reality, right?
It's all good. It's reality right now.
And my wife is also working remotely. She works in the school system as well, serving homeless students, McKinney-Vento students as a school social worker. So
yeah,
staying busy, that's the word.
That's the word. That's the word. And, I came into contact with your work, I believe through a couple of colleagues that I know. And then I also know that I had also connected you with a BEN, a Black Education Network, who does regional forums. And they were interested in doing a regional forum in North Carolina. And so we made that connection as well. I'm really impressed with the level of work that you've been able to do in this new organization that you started with, CREED, and really focusing, on equity. Tell us about how you got into this work, right? Was it because I feel like from what I know about you, similar to my story, we Black in America, a lot of things we get started because we've had some very direct and personal experiences, right, with these systems.
That's
so
right.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so not only are we both Black in America, but we're Black and Midwesterners in America. I'm a native of Northern Illinois, and so that puts you in proximity to a certain brand of racism, right? That people don't often talk about. So grew up Northern Illinois, and in a very circuitous way, ended up teaching at 29, leaving a nonprofit career, working with youth, and just falling in love with that. I taught for a year in Rockford, and then I moved to Charlotte. Sight unseen, didn't know much about Charlotte other than the weather was warm. And I taught for 5 years in a local high school, which was Black and brown, and quickly learned that school had a bad reputation. All the things that are associated with typical schools that are comprised that way. But I had a great time there. Those children changed my life, and I loved it. And I was fortunate enough to win State Teacher of the Year. And that put me on.
Congratulations again, by the way. That's
I
amazing.
appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, I was just
Can I
trying to do
just
my
point
job.
out that's amazing for a number of reasons, right? So, like
Hmm.
teacher demographics, number one, most
Right.
teachers in this country are, white women,
That's right.
and less than 1% of teachers in this country are Black men. That's
Hmm.
amazing that just shined as a teacher. And to me, it's a testament for the people like me and others who are advocating for more Black men, Black teachers, period, in K through 12 education. So shout out to you. Thank you.
I appreciate it. And I don't know how it happened, but it did. And it took me out my classroom. You spend a year on the road, going from one end of the state to the next, and I realized that North Carolina is not Charlotte. Charlotte is a city. You know what I'm saying? But the same issues that the Black and brown kids were facing in an urban situation, I was seeing in a suburban, rural, one in the high country, in the mountains, in the low country, out in the eastern part. And I was like, this is systemic, and like an organization should exist that really calls this out, that calls out the ways that racism operates in education. And after spending some years in policy, working in policy, and you read that bio, I just said, you know what? Since it doesn't exist, we got to create it. And that's what was the seed for the idea of the Center for Racial Equity in Education, because somebody got to be there to really just focus on race and not socioeconomics and everything, but racial equity. And that's why we're here. That's why we created it.
Amen. That's what's up. So let's get into it, man. I know you got a little bit of a presentation you want to share with us
For sure.
today.
For sure.
Let's bring it all the way back, you started off with that Midwest experience. As you know,
Mhm.
I'm a Midwesterner, born in Cleveland, Ohio, lived in Dayton 20 years before relocating here to the Washington, D.C. region. But yeah, let's hop into it. I think
Let's get into
we'll
it.
have the producer cue it up for us.
Yep. And I'll connect some of my personal story to some of the data from some research that we released earlier last year in the slideshow. And you'll kind of see, what my lens is, what informs my lens. And then we'll see also like what the data are saying about, how it's showing up even currently.
Yeah, and we know it's showing up currently.
Hmm.
Like even from my experience, one of the things that I noticed when dealing with my son back in 2011, the book that politicized me was by Dr. Jawanza Kunjufu. I'm sure you're familiar with him and his work.
Illinois State University grad. Absolutely.
Yeah. And he wrote Countering the Conspiracy to Destroy Black Boys. And the first edition of that book was 1983, right? Here I
Hmm.
was in 2011, and it was like he wrote the book a year ago. Like I was literally still having the same experiences with my son in preschool that
Hmm.
he was articulating was happening in 1983 and even before, right? So yeah, there's definitely nothing new under the sun, unfortunately, when it comes to racial inequity, particularly in education, and really anti-blackness. I mean, that's
Anti-blackness in particular. That's right.
anti-blackness in particular. Do we have the slide up? I don't think we can see it. Let us know, team, if we have that up and ready to go with it.
Right.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay. Excellent. So, yeah, I wanted to talk about violence and, the manifestations of violence because I feel like we experience it a lot of different ways, particularly right now with what we're seeing in the country. But I don't want us to be limited in understanding violence in just one way. And so I kind of talk about my journey in the way that I frame it. You can go to the next slide. So I want to start with my own personal story, and I want to introduce y'all to somebody who's near and dear to me, and that is my father. And you'll see a picture of him in this next slide. Um, I'm a junior, right? So I'm James E. Ford Jr. This is my dad, native of East Buffalo, New York, who ended up raising me in the Midwest. My father will turn 80 years old this month. And so he's, a blessed dude who's lived to see a lot of things. But he's also a guy who raised us with a particular consciousness, right? We knew who we were. He at the time had never finished college. He had entered and didn't complete, but he always had a book in front of him, always gave us what would now be considered like a level of Black consciousness and social identity. And there's 2 times I can ever say that my father really got angry enough to cuss as a result of my schooling experience. And I'm gonna narrate both of them for you. Next slide. So it took place when I was this age. So this is a picture of me. Everybody called me Jimmy, and folks who know me still do. I did not write the boy on my own yearbook picture; somebody else did. But it happened during my 7th grade year at West Middle School in Rockford, Illinois. And I really want to tell you about this kid because I was, attention deficit disorder, wasn't the best student, tended to act out every once in a while. But at the end of the day, I was a really good kid. And but there are some things that shape how I experienced school that give me the passion that I have now. Go to the next slide. In a particular class, my English class, and I won't name the teacher, but I had an experience where I really realized that why I didn't like school, right? Why I wasn't engaged. I always knew I was smart, but couldn't understand why school just didn't resonate with me. And this book really illustrated why. In my English class, which is full of Black and brown kids, they had us reading this book called The K. And this was an award-winning book at the time. And I have to tell you, this book bored the mess out of me. It not only was it slow moving and uninteresting, but it was the basic story was one that I felt upheld the narrative of systemic racism. So in the West Indies, in the Caribbean, there was a boat that was shipwrecked. It was a white family was trying to escape a particular island in what is now I believe, right in the Caribbean part of like South America. And they end up encountering a storm. The boat shipwrecks onto an island, and the book focuses on these 2 central characters: the young white boy who was blinded because of injuries he sustained, being a lone survivor, and then a Black man, an elderly Black man, West Indian Black man. And the story basically goes that they spend all this time on this island figuring out how to survive. And the older Black, sort of Uncle Remus looking Black man takes good care of this kid, right? Teaches him how to survive, essentially operates as his guardian while they're there alone. When his vision comes back to him, the young man realizes that the person who's been taking care of him is in fact Black. Well, the boy is a racist and be calling him all kind of N-words and everything else. Long story short, the Black man dies, the kid gets saved, and the story ends. And I remember thinking to myself, like, what in the world is this? Again, I'm in 7th grade. Like, this is what they got us reading.
And this was a best-selling book.
I kid you not. This book was an award-winning book. You can look it up for yourself.
And it won awards. Wow.
Yes. But as I was already had a critical enough conscience as a 7th grade, Black boy that I knew this wasn't cool. The type of books that my father had me reading that I wanted to read, that I was doing book reports on, were books like from the next slide. This is what I was reading in my free time, right? I was reading Seize the Time, right? By Bobby Seale, one of the founding members of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. And I was reading because my father told me about these guys, about the evolution and origin story and the things they did to respond to police brutality and the free breakfast programs. And, this was what I really wanted to read. But the gap between what I wanted to learn and what I was actually being taught kind of shows you the sort of what I would argue is curricular violence that takes place with a lot of young folks of color, but Black students in particular. Because it caused me to be disinterested and withdraw. And then, I ain't gonna lie, like I would cut up in class, but it was due to lack of interest. And so those things spin off into other behavioral issues, but really at the end of the day, it was curricular.
That's right. My husband had a similar experience, not to interject, but I just wanted to share that here we are, I'm not gonna assume your age, but my husband is in his early 40s. And what you just said literally is the same thing, almost verbatim, that he shared with me about his own experience in K through 12 education as a young Black boy. I just had to share that, the curriculum violence.
No, that's fair because DC, Illinois, relative age group, but the experience is the same. So it just kind of shows that those things were mirror images of each other. If you don't mind, we still had a couple more slides to go through. I just want to show you some of the data and some of the contemporary issues with physical violence that I think mirror the idea of curricular violence. And so physical violence is something else we've been looking at and exploring recently as a result of, I think, of course, the movement for Black Lives, but also some of the stuff happening at the school level as well. Let's take a look at the next slide and kind of show you this report that we put out. We produced a report in our first year of existence called Erasing Inequities. You see the word race in the middle there. And it's a empirical study, right, with all 1.5 million kids in North Carolina. And we cut it across a lot of different ways: education outcome and access indicators. And we wanted to see how is race showing up in meaningful ways in the education system that, limit the opportunity. And so we'll go to the next slide to show you some of the things that ended up coming up. This is just a snapshot of like suspensions. As a kid, you've seen this before. This is North Carolina data, and everybody knows what ISS is, in school suspension. Everybody knows what OSS is, out of school suspension. And these are all of the students in North Carolina who were suspended at least once. ISS and OSS, the percentages. We got it broken out by race. The state average is the red line that runs across the middle for OSS, and the yellow line is the state average for ISS. Look at the groups who are above the state average. And like, it don't take a genius, right, to see that there's a problem here. And as you mentioned from the outset, the problem is particularly anti-Black, but it also includes Native Americans and multiracial, mixed race students as well. So something's going on here that needs to be looked at. We'll go to the next slide as well. The other thing that I think is of interest is that what are students getting suspended for? This is what we realize. Like, Black folks know that our kids are under a microscope and that they get, they get dealt with, heavy-handed responses to minor infractions. But the research also shows that there's two major buckets of offenses, things that students get suspended for. The objective things are the things that are cut and dry. You don't got to interpret this stuff. This is like, if you bring drugs to school, if you bring a weapon, if you assault the staff, if you, destroy property, that as long as you can prove somebody did it, there's no questions about how that should be handled. That's objective. And then there's subjective offenses. These are the things that really are a matter of judgment. Whoever is handling the discipline, be it the dean of students or be it the principal, they make the judgment call. And those things are like insubordination, disrespect, threatening behavior. Well, come on now. How do you interpret that? Whose eyes are viewing that? And like, what's the cultural lens that's being used? We see that Black students in North Carolina are the ones who get suspended most for the subjective offenses. So that tells us that that's a problem there. Even if we don't necessarily know what it is, it gives us a hint. We'll go to the next slide to talk a little bit more about what some of the problem is as well. Who gets involved in the criminal justice system? And this is not our data. This is taken from Southern Coalition for Social Justice. They released what are called racial equity report cards here in North Carolina for every school district. And this is for the whole district, whole state writ large. But you see here that the percentage of complaints in the state that lead to juvenile court, a good fraction of those, 45%, are school-based. That's almost half of them. Meaning they start at school, that they end up starting at school, and then they end up in contact with the criminal justice system. So school, y'all heard the phrase school to prison pipeline, that shows that it's a problem. At the far right, you see the actual proportions of racial demographics in our state. So we're only 26%, roughly 25, 26% Black as a whole state in terms of school. But the majority of school-based complaints are coming from Black kids and for Black kids, 47%. So why is that so disproportionate, And so that's, again, just pointing to the problem I keep trying to spell out. And we'll go to the next slide.
Real quick, can we spend a little time, and leave the slide up, please? Can we spend a little time just dispelling this myth that Black children are worse? Because one of the things that I get a lot of times, Brother James, is like when we talk about the data like this and we say, oh, but it's disproportionate, then you'll have people be like, oh, but Black kids are worse anyway. That's why it's disproportionate. They're the ones who doing everything. That's a lie.
Wrong. That is a lie.
And yeah, so just spend a little bit of time like really framing that with the data. Because if you look at the data on its face, what I have found, at least in my organizing, is that people will say, well, the Black kids are the worst.
And you know what's sad? I know I haven't even talked about this with you, and I know without even asking that some of the folks be saying that are Black folk too. We believe we've internalized our own oppression, and we believe the hype. The fact of the matter is, and it's been researched a lot, there is no evidence to support that Black students behave disproportionately worse, right? In fact, when you compare apples to apples, like white kids and Black kids doing the same offenses at the same rate, Black kids get suspended more. There's a report called Two Strikes, a research called Two Strikes, where it just looks at, it takes folks and it puts two phony discipline reports in front of teachers, one with two typical white names and one with two typical Black names, and they got the same infractions. And it shows it's a Black escalation effect, meaning after the second offense, they start punishing the phony Black student worse than the white student, even when they're committing it's the same phony discipline profile. We just respond differently to the same stuff we see with the police, the lack of de-escalation. It's the same stuff that happens in the school. And that's why I want folks to understand how racism operates across every institution. We're dealing with the same phenomena, just in a different space. So thank you for pausing to talk about that, because that's a lie. It's not true.
And Russ Skiba, I used his research out of Indiana State University. His research pointed to the same thing. I think it was something like our Black children worst question. And, then of course he gets down into the data and lifted up basically, like you said, this has been researched over and over again, but for some reason people refuse to dispel the myth in their minds. But anyway, let's keep going through your slide presentation. I just always think it's really important for us to stop when we are talking about this data and really remind our listeners and our audience to, like you, even Black people, to undo this idea that somehow our children are just born worse.
Right. And I appreciate you referencing Russell Skiba too, because he is that dude when it comes to the discipline stuff. Yep. So you're right. And just to let you know that everything ain't black and white, the phrase all skin folk and kinfolk. You go to the next slide. We've heard a lot of complaints. Recently, we have heard from young people wanting to abolish SRO, school resource officers at school, for that precise reason we're talking about here, because they already exist in the school system. They know them doesn't treat them fair, and so being around police doesn't make them feel any more comfortable. There's a couple high profile cases in North Carolina that made the news. Last year, 2019, there was a school resource officer who slammed an 11-year-old boy, my son is 11, to the ground, and he was caught on video. Now, guess what color the officer was? Black. So again, I don't want to make, again, I'm all for, diversity and inclusion. But like Cornel West says, sometimes you just have Black faces in high places. Sometimes too, who end up doing the same exact
faces
stuff.
on white supremacy, exactly.
Absolutely. And so the problem is that alone is not going to fix it. It's we got to be a little more critical than that, than just saying, oh, this person looks like me. And then outside of Raleigh, there's another video of a young Black girl getting slammed to the ground, allegedly trying to break up a fight. So this stuff happens all the time. I've seen it, etc. Sure, all SROs aren't bad. I know some good ones, but we ain't talking about individual officers. We're talking about a system. And so that's the critique here. Go on to the next thing. There's some cool stuff being done here where our Chief Justice, who was a Black woman, Sherry Beasley, worked with the governor to form what's called school justice partnerships. And they are trying to diminish the disproportionate contact of kids of color in the juvenile justice system. And so they're working with districts to look at their suspension numbers and try to get down the suspensions and their expulsions, and their referrals, so that they can help to cut this off. This is still in the early stages, and we got 115 districts, and all, not even a quarter of them have SJPs. So this is early work,
This is amazing. So the school justice partnership, is it a partnership between sort of like educators? Is law enforcement involved in this? Are parents and students also involved?
All the above. So schools, the law enforcement, the local law enforcement, the court system as well, and of course parents and students. And they're trying to figure out ways, and it varies from one district to the next, but ways to help diminish those numbers, because there's a recognition that there's a problem, right? And you can't just allow it to happen in and of itself. And so that was announced, I want to say last year. So like I said, it's still in the infant stages, but it's a good step forward. I think got to be acknowledged as a plus. So I don't want, I don't want to spend all the time on this, but let me just zip through a couple more slides and then we can kind of, go back and forth, have some conversation. We released a policy brief last year with my good friend, Dr. John Williams from Texas A&M. And John looked at some of the policy things that could happen to help mitigate this. And in North Carolina, students who are suspended actually don't have the right to appeal a suspension as it currently stands. Yeah, in our general statute. Um, unless the local district adopts a policy that gives them that right. And so what we basically said was this is a really good area to begin some reforms and some transformation that starts to give the student a little more agency as opposed to just being subject to a system that doesn't really have the best interest in mind. And so we're pretty proud of that, but you can get that from our website. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And if you haven't seen this documentary, I think you should. Wilmington, of course, is in North Carolina. It's the only documented successful coup d'etat in the United States history, government takeover. And we work really
Wait, repeat
closely.
that. It's the only what?
Documented successful coup d'etat, which is a successful government takeover.
Wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's been several race riots for sure, but this was a government takeover. This was a political overthrow in the way that we would understand that in nations abroad. It was a multiracial government that was overthrown by a paramilitary group called the Red Shirts. I'll just let you sit with that. But for real, in Wilmington's a district we work with very closely, and as Creed, and so that history is still there, it's still here, and it's something we need to know about because, and we'll go to the next slide and we'll jump up out of here. Because unfortunately, even now, we still see that the ideas of white supremacy, of physical violence, still pervade police departments. At the end of the school year, this young man who lives out in Wilmington, actually goes to Michael Jordan's alma mater, Laney High School, was confronted by a white mob outside of his door. They were looking for a missing white girl. And the thing I want to mention here is that in that mob was 2 sheriff's deputies in the region. I kid you not. And so, I mean, we're talking about, physical violence and law enforcement because these ideologies are not dead. And so if he can't feel safe in school and out of school, then where can he feel safe? So, we can kind of cut it off right there and just kind of have a conversation, Zakia. But
Yeah.
I just wanted to kind of review that stuff with you and connect all of it in our work.
No, this is serious though, brother. And this is timely. We all living in America right now. We know we had a so-called presidential debate where we had a current sitting president of the United States say to people who are like this mob to stand back and stand by. This is critical that we have this conversation, and it's definitely connected to education. It's connected to every institution that we have to deal with. And it's not just North Carolina. There's certainly paramilitary groups and all these other kind of groups and white militias and things like that in Maryland, where I live, in Ohio and Oregon, everywhere. And so I think this is a really good time, that we center these kind of conversations right now, especially as this election continues to near. We have a president who's indicating that he's going to use the Supreme Court to stay in power. I'm not trying to scare people. This is all in the media. Yeah. This is all in the media. Listen to this man. If you're on Twitter, watch his tweets. I mean, this is really critical. And so I feel like, you and I can just have a conversation right now, and you're in North Carolina, I'm in Maryland, just straight up and down, for me, I know I've been having conversations with my husband. I know I've been having conversations with my children, right? I know I've been straight up like, okay, contingency plans, because to me it's that serious. When he said in the presidential debate that he is telling his people, right, to monitor the polls during the voting, all I could see was the images from the civil rights movement of our people, Black people, trying to vote and having dogs sicked on them, having white mobs spitting on them. There's images out of Virginia that happened last week where Trump people with their signs and everything were standing outside of the voting place, intimidating people trying to come in to vote. So we're not necessarily talking about things that happened 50 years ago at this point. We're talking about stuff that's happening now, that's
Right.
current. And how are our children, like, how are we having this conversation since most of our children are home? I know some schools are doing hybrids, some schools are in session with masks and everything. How are you and your family, what kind of conversations are you all having down in North Carolina about this very real threat?
Yeah. So, at the end of the day, I'm a history teacher, and the virtue of history is that if we pay attention, it gives you all the jewelry, all the gems you need to predict the future, because everything that has happened will happen. Past is prologue. And so, I mean, the beauty and the ugliness of the situation is that we've been here before in some iteration. This is not the first time that we've had a categorically racist president. This is not the first time, as Dr. King said in his speech, the other America, that you've had a white backlash. This is not the first time that the threat of vigilante violence has occurred, as I just mentioned, in Wilmington and other places. And so,
I
I
will
personally,
say, I will say really quickly, just an addendum that I think, and you're the history teacher, so correct me if I'm wrong, but this may be the first time, at least in modern history, that white people realize that they are about to be a minority. And in some states, they are already a minority, and that's connected to the backlash.
that that is an excellent caveat, and that is what's different, right? Is that this is in response to the changing demographics of a nation that was pretty much, and I laugh when people say we're identity politics, because literally white identity politics is what shaped America, right? It's there in the Constitution of founding documents, right? It determined who could have access to what, and so I've had to be honest with my kids, and I got 4 of them. We've had to have conversations about what fascism is. If I'm being 100% honest, what to do if roving, marauding, groups,
Real
paramilitary
talk,
groups show up in the neighborhood, right? And
right?
there's those. What I will say is there are those of us who've learned our lessons from history, and so we prepared ourselves accordingly.
That's right.
But with everybody else, I think you just got to pay attention to the cues. We have families and communities to protect, and I'm African American. I descend from enslaved Africans in America,
Me too, brother.
and so I mean this is my land. And so that being said, the guy who we're talking about, he's just a symptom of the problem. It doesn't matter who wins or who doesn't. We're going to have to continue to fight this no matter what. And so I'm in it for the long haul as best as possible. But ultimately, we got to make sure we're having real conversations with our family, our friends, about what to do in the wake of something really bad jumping off. And, God forbid, but it is what it is.
It is what it is at this point, and I appreciate that you being willing to go there with me, because it kind of came up in that last slide. I'm like, I can't not
Yeah,
make that connection to what's happening
yeah,
now. you know
yeah.
so the other thing that I wanted to make sure that I touch on, and I've been doing this in my shows for the last couple of months, and this is something that's very real that I see continuing to happen. I had an opportunity to speak to Education Week. They did a big package on COVID-19 and equity, and they interviewed a lot of parents. They interviewed me. They interviewed several parents back in Ohio that I recommended, interviewed a couple of parents that I recommended on the West Coast, because I wanted to make sure that there was a good geographical kind of mix of what families and parents are experiencing during this time. And you would not be surprised that one of the themes is that, of course, Black parents, particularly working class Black parents, have not been meaningfully engaged in a lot of the plans that districts have been releasing, right? One of the things that I wrote about in my opinion piece that was published by Ebony in September, is that, one of the frustrations is that, we're making decisions for people without engaging them, right? And this is not to be divisive, but right now the power in opening and closing schools has rested solely with educators. When you have students and parents who are also a part of that whole ecosystem that have not necessarily had a say. And that's been a tension, and I've written about that. We have 17 million children in this country. When districts decided to go online, who don't even have broadband access. You have some districts who have stepped up and provided, hotspots and tried to do the best they can to help mitigate some of that. But there's still districts in this country that have not done that. There's some districts in this country who don't have the money to do that, right? And so one of the frustrations that I'm seeing is that we're going to have opportunity gaps, I believe, unfortunately, that may be irreversible if we don't step up and do something now. Do something very bold. And I'm not saying that put people, at risk of becoming COVID-19 or eventually, having some kind of safety risk with that. But I do think we need to do something much more creative and different. What are your thoughts on that? And how are you guys handling that in North Carolina?
So you raise a lot of good questions. I'm gonna try to touch on like 4 things. One is, you're absolutely right. Parents have not been meaningfully engaged in the conversations about reentry, or reopening. And it's, you could argue that it's typical of the way we make most decisions when they're non-crisis related. We just don't engage parents, particularly parents of color, who are least proximate to power, right? And or poor parents, right? Low income parents. I'm gonna be honest and say, in North Carolina, frankly though, that they also, and this is why it's complex, haven't engaged educators very well. And so, whereas educators, what you would expect, would typically have more of a voice, the initial conversations that I was witnessing, and if I'm being honest, even at the state board level, when we were first considering what to do, we hadn't talked to a lot of educators. And so then the question is like, who are you talking to, right? Just the scientists or, the elected officials. But so you got stakeholders, you got parents and community members, and you got teachers and educators and staff members who also might be unduly putting themselves at risk. And sometimes folks fit both profiles, right? They're parents who are also educators. And so as a model, I just think we got to do a better job at, being more public facing and not doing what's politically convenient. The parents who often do weigh in on the conversations, and it's happening here now, especially as districts starting to relax and, bring students back in, are typically parents who belong to groups that already have power and privilege. We're talking about white, upper and middle class parents.
Right.
And oftentimes they're arguing these things under the banner of equity, which I will say I find incredibly suspicious, particularly when these groups don't have a documented record of standing up for equity at any other time. So, and the way systemic racism works is, no matter what we do, whether you keep folks virtual, and in North Carolina, you got regions of our state that don't even have access to broadband. They don't have the infrastructures, Zakiya. Man, you go out into the eastern part of North Carolina, which is very rural and very Black, and southeast, which is rural, Black, and indigenous. They don't have the infrastructure. So you put a hotspot in their hand, it doesn't mean nothing because they don't have the towers. They don't have access to broadband.
Wow.
I'm trying to tell you. So, I mean, it's a deep deal. But you kind of, forget the pun here. You damned if you damned if you don't, because, on the one hand, the kids who are going to suffer the worst if we stay in a virtual mode are going to be kids of color. Kids who are more likely to be at risk if we show up in person, contract COVID, die from COVID, are going to be who? Kids of color. That's the way systemic racism works. Is no matter what the arrangement is, we always end up at the bottom. So the question becomes, what can we gain? Can we regain a year of learning? And there are going to be gaps. You ain't lying. That's possible, but you can't regain a life. So that's always the balance that I'm always asking myself is, what can potentially be mitigated and what can be lost permanently?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Is there conversations in terms of funding and policymaking? If they don't have, because the way we're going, people aren't trusting a vaccine that's being manufactured in 4 months when it takes 4 to 7 years to do that, right? So we're talking about potentially years of dealing with this COVID-19. Where is the conversations on, and not necessarily, like I said, because I mean, some places in this country could have had school outside, socially distanced. You know what I'm saying? And so that's not even happening. I think LA was one of the first districts to announce, oh, we just gonna be virtual. And they did have educators. In fact, the educators were the ones that led it out there. You know, there's a strong union there. I mean, Maryland also has strong unions. So I understand in the Southeast, teachers do not necessarily have strong voice at the table or strong collective bargaining. So that's definitely different. But even in places where teachers do have a stronger voice and like actual hammer with their collective bargaining agreements, still in situations like that, to me, I think, you know, there has been a lack of creativity when it comes to educating our children. I also wrote a piece called School is Essential. And I think starting from that, for me, like not just saying, oh, okay, we can just do it virtually, you know, not realizing, because I think a lot of people, including me, didn't realize that there are still, like you just described, there are places in this country that don't even have the infrastructure. Is there conversations in your state legislature that say, okay, we need to get some dollars down to Southwest or the southern region of North Carolina. We got to build up some towers down there so that these children can learn, because we may be dealing with COVID for the next 2 or 3 years.
You know, you raised, the conversations are happening in North Carolina. And I will give credit to our legislation. In 2018, they had released a broadband study to see what regions of the state had access to broadband, which ones didn't. And then the ones that have access, what are the subscription rates? Just because you got access to something, doesn't mean you got the money to pay for it also. As in response, not everybody knows, right? Like, yo, you know, internet is gonna have to be, like, in my opinion, like a human rights issue now. Access to high-speed internet, you know, like it's got to be a utility, you know, tantamount to water and electricity. It just has to, because, you know, the world is globalizing, and this has just laid bare who really has access and who doesn't. I think some of us are embarrassed. But the other thing is, a kid, you know, when it comes to ponying up the cash, when it comes to spending the dollars to truly close the opportunity gaps, which are structural, as you mentioned, which go beyond education, it instantly becomes politicized. It becomes politicized. And by politicized, I mean it becomes partisan, because it's political because it deals with politics. But it becomes an issue of ideology and partisan. I mean, it's like the stimulus relief. Like, can't nobody argue folks need more than $1,200 one time? But getting that through instantly becomes a matter of which party you belong to. And I know you, like me, like I'm nonpartisan. I don't care about that stuff. You know what I mean? I'm about the issues. I'm about the policies. But it gets lost in that minutia, and it doesn't move, and it only stays in the gear of conversation, or it doesn't move fast enough because, you know, folks are motivated by particular ideologies. And that's the frustrating part, is that, you know, like you mentioned, the families we're talking about, you know, they're suffering, you know, for the mom who has to go to work every day and has to essentially leave her kids there or go to a learning pod if that's available in the community. You're putting a lot of trust in, you know, those interventions to continue education at a level that's similar to what it was in a regular atmosphere, which wasn't great then. You know what I mean? So it's a lot. And I do worry, I'm not gonna lie to you, about what the result and what the impact is gonna be generationally. But I do think we're gonna see it 20, 30 years from now.
Yeah, I'm also very concerned about that generationally, and that's why I wanted to start off with the impact school is essential. And don't get me wrong, I'm not married to we got to go to a building to receive an education. I want to explore all options. Where is the direct education stipends for families? Those families who don't have access to broadband, the community needs to come together down there, because the teachers are still there. The teachers can, you know, form, like you said, some kind of pod. But my thing is, there probably aren't the resources even down there for the families to start a pod. You know, okay, y'all don't want to provide broadband, you'll have to provide something. If we gonna have like little small schools or outside or something like that in the field or whatever, education has to happen. Black people have done this even when we couldn't learn how to read. We figured out strategies. You feel me? Where is that level of creativity? That's my frustration. And I also think, like we have to be demanding that. We can't just say, because I've been also seeing people say, oh, I think we should just chalk this year up. I don't know anybody that's a parent think that that's a good idea. like we should just chalk this year up. It's not just about this year. We're talking about a pandemic. It takes 4 to 7 years to develop a vaccine. We got a president talking about the vaccine gonna be ready next month. No, ma'am. No, sir. Come on, man.
No, you're right. You're right.
We gotta laugh to keep from crying, man.
It's true. It's true. So Freedom Hill is one of our at Creed. I should pause to say, my partner and co-founder is not here with me, but Janine Bryant and now we both run it. And Freedom Hill is like our organizing body. And before COVID-19, we were already attempting to structure a statewide coalition of folks, multiracial, cross-sector, whole region, of people who care about racial equity and education. But there ain't no agenda. Like, we all know the kids of color are getting robbed. Everybody knows that the system doesn't serve them well on its best day. But what's the ask? What are the demands we're making? What's the agenda? What's the sheet of music we're playing by? And we've kind of, positioned ourselves to help with the formulation of that. And since COVID has hit, those are some of the things that are starting to bubble to the surface. Is, to your point, as a community, we have to find out that, we got to go beyond asking for certain things. You got to make demands of the power structures. And furthermore, we got to tap in as Black people to our lineage of not accepting no for an excuse, right? Vanessa Siddle Walker, right? Author, researcher, from North Carolina, from Caswell County, does a great job documenting those segregated schools in the South that we're working with less, that we're in those inferior buildings, but we're figuring out a way to still offer, in many cases, really good education. But it's because they weren't just accepting inferior status. They were finding ways to cobble resources together. They didn't have no bus system. Them folks would pool their money together and donate an axle. Seriously, this is some of the stories she documents in Their Highest Potential, and then get money from the district to put a frame on the axle. But it's the community who brought the axle to the table, right? To transport students. So what are we doing to fill those gaps in the meantime while we're waiting on systems and structures to respond? I think it's a valid question.
No, I think that's right. And I think, one of the things, and as just so people know, as a Bright Beam team, we are currently having these conversations. Like, we're currently, like, when you say what the agenda and what the demands are, we've already asked ourselves that question. We're already having these, brainstorming, mind share, and also, like, keeping into context our current political environment, because we would be remiss not to, have a plan of action within this current very tensions political environment, and one of the things that I think for us, though, is that we're very clear that we have to center the children. We're very clear that as adults we have to, especially the children who are already at the margins. We were already fighting for them to get equity when the schools was open before COVID. That's a fact. We got to fight even harder now.
Yeah. That's a
fact.
And
I think for us, that's what we're starting with. That's why I started with, okay, we're not going backwards. We're not going back to where some kids just not getting an education at all. We cannot do that. And we can't accept the fact that most of those children would be Black, brown, and indigenous. That to me has to be the starting place. It is unacceptable.
That's right.
For us to accept that Black, brown, and indigenous children will not be educated. I made a point earlier, and this is not a conspiracy. To me, it's just an observation. I made a point earlier when we were talking about, the current environment of, white supremacist terrorism. And and when you were talking about historically, we've been here before. What I said was different, though, at least in modern history, because I know that during enslavement, that there were places where Black people outnumbered whites in terms of, like, demographics, just because of, how many of us they had working at any point in time, during enslavement. But in modern history, we are embarking on a new phase where in some states already are majority people of color, or majority minority is what they call it. And that we're becoming that way. Projections show that by 2050 or before, probably, we will have a majority people of color country. To me, that's connected to this idea of resources. To
Mhm.
me, that's connected to the policies and practices that we see coming out of state legislators, federal government, and everything. These people have, at the Heritage Foundation and other think tanks, have already looked at it like, well, we ain't paying for public education for everybody if the kids ain't white.
You better believe it.
And
Yep.
so to me, we got to have that thinking, at least in our mind, for how we strategize and come up with a plan and say, oh, no, our kids have to be educated. Even
Mhm.
if that means we have to do what we've done in the past and educate our own. Now, see, that part might be controversial,
Uh-huh.
but we can have all the controversy all you want to. The writing is still on the wall, in my opinion.
Well, listen, you raise a really interesting point, and one is it's why a lot of folks. What you said is why a lot of folks, including myself, have abandoned the phrase minority because it's not accurate. Um, when we say minoritized, because we're still treated like minorities, or say rising majority, right? Because that's really what's happening right now. Is we are, as a collective of Black, Brown, and Indigenous folk, a rising majority. But the other thing is, a lot of what you're saying is true. The thrust of desegregation was based on the idea that surely, white folks are not going to leave behind their own children. And so, eh, by gaining proximity and being in the same buildings, there are certain tangible benefits. No doubt, I'm a product of that. But the underlying assumption that uh, our kids will fare better just by being proximate is not true. Because the same thing as it prevents districts from being brave and bold enough to make decisions that will go against, in some cases, is the minority of these districts, which is the white minority, because they're afraid that they will run them off and that they'll leave the district, and the district will be majority Black and brown. And I'm beginning to say, okay, so if that does happen, right, you still got an obligation to teach those kids. So you can't make decisions because, oh, well, this will run, the white parents and the white community way. But that's almost a concession that you're making decisions based upon what the white minority says. And in that case, us being, it being more people of color doesn't mean a doggone thing. You don't believe me? Look at South Africa, right? Look at Rhodesia, the former Rhodesia. Those were majority, Black and brown folk
White minority
countries.
rule.
Right, but it
Exactly.
was exactly so. Us having more numerically doesn't necessarily translate to greater power, and so we got to begin to put our stake in the ground and say, are we or are we not? No matter the circumstance, if it's integrated, if it's racially isolated, are we going to do what's necessary to teach those kids? And I do want to say, I want to take, I want to highlight some young folk who have inspired me, and that's the Wake County Black Student Coalition. And this is not an organization that is expressly connected to Creed, but I have been in conversation with these young folk, and we talked about where we could assist them. But they're a coalition themselves of students outside of Raleigh. Wake County is where Raleigh is seated, and if we could put their demands up there, they've already begun approaching the State Board of Education and their local district with a set of demands, right? Pre-COVID, things that they want to see happen. And one of the things you see that rises to the top there is abolition of school resource officers. The other thing is they want like staff accountability. They want the teachers, the folks who are in charge of them, to be held accountable for the things that they say and do in front of them. Hiring more folks of color, right, to speak to the students, right? A safe system against sexual harassment, and then they talk often about gender violence, and then they want to learn more about themselves. And so these are folk who aren't waiting for the adults to say what they want. The young people, as you see even in the streets, are organizing themselves. I think we need to take a cue and recognize that historically, every major movement, I don't care what it is, pick one, has been led by young people because they haven't been living long enough to be told and get jaded to say they can't do stuff. And the other thing is they ain't scared like we are. They don't have all of the things and all the stuff to lose that we do. I mean, because listen, that steady paycheck, that direct deposit hit every month, listen, come on now, there's a level of comfort that comes with that, right? It's like, man, I agree with you, but that direct deposit, I get it, right? And in our status, and young people are willing to risk it all, but we got to do our part to support them and make sure that their voices are heard. And so I just wanted to throw those demands up there as an example that young people are not waiting for the adults.
Man, that's fire. And I meant to actually mention them and lift them up early. As you know, I'm connected to a lot of folks in the Raleigh-Durham area. Shout out to Education Justice Alliance, Letha
EJA,
and
absolutely.
Fernando. Letha's my home girl. That's my sister,
Mine
right?
too. That's my
you
G all
know,
day long.
of course, Big Will down there with Village of Wisdom. They're my
Hmm.
homies. Like North Carolina is amazing, right?
Yep.
There's a sister down on the school board in what's the county down there?
Guilford County.
Guilford. Yeah, Kim
Yeah, yeah,
Irvin.
Kim. Yep.
So I'm deep with my relationships down in North Carolina, and I really am just looking from afar, just and applauding the work that you all are doing collectively. I feel inspired for Black kids in North Carolina, quite honestly. It's so many organizations. You got our brother Will looking at Black Genius and looking at curriculum and working directly
Hmm.
with the Wake County, or I'm sorry, Durham school district and everything. So it's something that I think is apropos for us to kind of wrap up our conversation
For sure.
on this positive note. We've talked about all of the problems. We talked about the historical issues, but I'm so glad that you brought up that these young people have organized themselves, right? And that there are adults like EJA, like your organization, that are standing with them. I believe ACLU of North Carolina is very involved with them as well in supporting their demands and holding the school district and school board accountable to those demands. So I'm really, really inspired by what I see coming out of North Carolina.
We appreciate that, and I gotta say, everyone you named is family, right? Like for real. Like we support each other, not just our work, but like we work together, and frankly, like we drop each other's names when we have funding conversations. You
That's
understand what I'm saying?
right.
Like it's
That's
that
right.
kind of love, and and something is up down here. These are some of the best people I've ever been around. We mentioned Letha's, the Wills, the Kim Irbies, and several other like organizations. And so we're in a very good position that I think that many of the things we're talking about, so long as we're around, they're not going to stay the same.
That's right. That's right. So that's good, man. This has been a very inspiring conversation. Just telling it like it is. That's what we strive to do on Building Power. We strive to highlight grassroots organizations and our allies, who are doing the real work to build power in marginalized communities, particularly Black communities. You know what I mean? And I feel like, we've done that here. I feel like just before we wrap, though, in terms of some practical, I guess, kind of like advice or next steps
Hmm.
that we can give to some of our listeners. They've been very active in the comments, not necessarily any questions, but the comment section has been very active and very positive. I just wanted to share that. But in terms of, just any kind of positive or uplifting words for parents, educators, right,
Hmm.
who are coping during this time, especially as some districts are, looking at doing hybrid plans where there's going to be, I know here in Montgomery County, Maryland, which is a suburban DC, our district are starting to have conversations about bringing small groups or certain sub sections of students back, like the, ESL students,
Hmm.
the students with disabilities, the K through fifth grade students. We know that online is just not age appropriate for a kindergartner, preschooler, even a first and second grader, right?
Right.
So we're having those conversations. Any kind of, I don't know, encouragement you want to have for educators and families who just trying to figure this thing out?
Yeah. So in the interest of building power, understand that you already have power. It's just about figuring out how to aggregate it. I don't believe in anybody empowering us. They can't give us something that we already have. You already have power. I don't care what your station in life is. Figuring out where power within the system lives and directing your strategies there. Figuring out who makes the decisions, whether it be your local board of education in North Carolina, the county commission is the one who gives the money to our local boards. Figuring out where your state board of education is, figuring out the general assembly. Find out where power lives, and you make your voice heard, and you direct and target your strategies to those power brokers and those power holders. But you let them know that you're here and that you're not taking no for an answer, like you said, Zakia, right? That now is the time. Today is a new day, and folks are gonna be forced to answer to y'all, or they're gonna have to reckon with y'all. And so that's what I would say. I leave y'all with.
That's beautiful, brother. Again, I appreciate you. This has been great. We definitely want to have you come back at some point, just kind of get an update of where you guys are, the kind of work that you all are continuing to move down there. And just thank you for your work. Thank you for centering race. Thank you for centering marginalized children in the state of North Carolina. They are important, and certainly they matter. Well, this has been your edition this week of Building Power with me, your host, Zakiya Sankara Jabbar. We're looking forward to seeing you next week. Next week, we are bringing on an educator, former kindergarten teacher in Washington, D.C. public schools, to talk about his work and some of the work that he's continuing to look at with regards to standardized testing and other issues of equity in the Washington, D.C. region. Brother Jeff Kennedy will be our guest. Thank you so much. Until next week, peace. Thanks.